The Brenner dispersal sale was held on the last Thursday of August, on a mountain road so steep the auction tables had to be weighted on the downhill side to stay level. 38 years of the Brenner family's goat keeping was moving in a single afternoon. Of the 61 animals listed, 8 were sound. They sold before noon. The remaining 53 carried a notation in the sale notice that auctioneers include for legal completeness rather than commercial encouragement. Locomotor difficulties of varied origin and severity, all ambulatory but not suitable for steep terrain work, offered as a lot, no separation. Every livestock man at that sale completed the same calculation inside of 30 seconds. A goat that could not navigate steep terrain in the Alps could not reach the high summer pasture. A goat that could not reach the high pasture could not return the investment of feeding it through winter. The arithmetic resolved in one direction only, and every practical buyer directed his attention toward the 8 sound animals that had already sold. Nella Voss did not look at the sound animals. She was 44 years old, a widow of 3 years, running a 12-acre holding on the middle slope of the Cellar Valley on careful management, and the kind of patience that grief either produces or destroys, depending on the person. She had come to the Brenner sale with the specific intention she had been forming since the previous week when she had read the sale notice and arrived at the locomotor difficulties line and remained with it. She had kept goats briefly, 2 seasons, years before her husband's illness had made the management impossible, not long enough to be considered experienced, long enough to notice something that the valley's conventional wisdom had never had occasion to examine. The goats that ranged least produced milk longest. Not more milk at peak. The high-ranking animals won at peak volume, but the animals that stayed on the lower pasture, that walked shorter distances, that did not spend their energy on the climb and the descent each day, continued milking into the autumn weeks when the ranging animals had already dried off. They produced steadily where the others produced dramatically and then stopped. She had written this observation down, and had not had occasion to act on it until the Brenner sale notice arrived in her kitchen. 53 goats that could not climb, or 53 goats that would not range. 53 goats that would not range, were 53 goats that would still be producing in October. In November, past the point where every other dairy operation in the Cellar Valley had closed its season and was working from stored goods until spring. She raised her hand and bought the lot for $16.20. The men at the sale said what men say. She arranged for the animals to be walked to her property that afternoon and stood at the lower pasture gate and counted them through, every last one. She wrote a single entry in her observation book that evening. 53 animals, all present, lower pasture only, begin in the morning. She knew this the way a woman knows something she cannot yet prove, that a goat that cannot go up is not a failed animal. It is an animal that will stay where you put it. And staying where you put it, on a mountain where the conventional wisdom sent everything as high as it could go, was not a limitation. It was the beginning of a system. She spent September watching and recording. Morning and evening milking. Volume, character, time elapsed. More record-keeping than any dairy operation in the valley maintained, and more than was strictly necessary for a small operation. But she was not building a small operation. She was building knowledge, and knowledge requires the kind of documentation that produces something to refer back to when the question arrives. By the end of September, the pattern her memory held from 2 seasons 20 years earlier was confirmed in the observation book in specific numbers. The 53 animals were producing at a rate that approached what she had expected from a sound, high-ranking herd at midsummer peak, from animals that had cost $16.20 and that the valley considered unmarketable. By mid-October, the confirmation arrived in the most useful possible form. The valley's sound herds were coming down from the high pasture in the procession of alpine autumn. Production calendars were closing. Every other dairy operation in the Kessler Valley was entering its off-season. Her 53 animals were still milking. She sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in October with the observation book open and the figures in front of her, and thought about what she could make from milk that would hold through winter, that would improve with time, that could be produced in the specific conditions her holding offered. A cool stone outbuilding on the north face of the property, built into the slope, temperature consistent year-round, not the temperature of the air outside, but the steady temperature of the mountain's thermal mass, which in that north-facing structure ran between 34 and 38 degrees regardless of the season above it. She wrote one word below the October figures. Cheese. She had never made it. This informed her planning rather than stopping it. She learned in the correct order, which is the order the process itself requires. The culture, the curd, the press, the salt, the rind, the cave. The cave was what she had, and what she understood, working through the pamphlet from the provincial agricultural office and the accumulated knowledge of valley women whose families had made cheese for generations, was that the stone outbuilding on her north face was not merely useful for aging. It was, for the specific style of aged mountain cheese she was attempting, precisely correct. Warm stone held heat. Cool stone held cold. The mountain maintained the outbuilding at the temperature it chose, and the temperature it chose was the temperature the cheese required. Nothing about it looked magical. Every part looked earned. The first wheel was too acidic. The culture had run long and needed tighter timing. The second wheel split in the press. The frame she had built applied uneven pressure and needed modification. She modified the frame. She adjusted the timing. The third wheel came out of the press in the second week of November with the correct texture and the correct density, and went onto the aging shelf with a surface that her hands told her was closer to right than the first two had been. She salted it, she turned it on the schedule, she watched it. The systems were beginning to support one another. The milk that her 53 lame goats were still producing in November, 6 weeks past the point where every other dairy in the valley had stopped, was going into wheels of aged mountain cheese resting in a stone building, whose temperature the mountain maintained without her managing it. She allowed herself one moment of satisfaction, the evening the third wheel was complete. Then she went to check the animals. December arrived and the high passes closed. The Kessler Valley sealed itself into the self-sufficiency that mountain communities in winter have always depended on, living inside the consequences of what was prepared in the months when preparation was still possible. Her animals were still milking in December, reduced from October but steady, the reliable production of animals that had never been pushed to peak and were declining from a lower point and more slowly, sufficient for one additional wheel per week through January. Every other dairy operation in the valley was producing nothing. The aging wheels from October and November were developing on the shelves. She turned them on schedule. She checked the rinds for the qualities the pamphlet described and that her own observation was now supplementing. The correct firmness, the smell of proper aging rather than spoilage, the sound a wheel makes when tapped that tells a person paying attention whether the interior is developing correctly. The answer arrived quietly in the third week of December. She cut a small piece from the edge of an October wheel to check its trajectory. 6 weeks of aging. Not finished. The schedule she was following called for 4 months minimum, with better character at 6. But the piece she tasted had a quality that 6 weeks of careful work in a north-facing stone building on a mountain slope in winter had produced. It had the quality of something someone would travel for. She noted this without elaboration. October wheels on correct trajectory. Continue. She continued. The work was daily and unglamorous, turning wheels, checking rinds, milking animals, recording figures, adjusting what the figures told her needed adjusting. The work of a person who understands that a system does not maintain itself, and that the person who built the system is responsible for maintaining it. She was, by January, the only person on the mountain with aging cheese and producing animals. She had not yet told anyone. She was not ready. February was the month the mountain tested everyone. The pass had been closed since December, supply arrangements suspended. Families who had not put by in sufficient quantity were encountering the arithmetic of winter on a mountain, which does not offer extensions. A mail carrier named Jonah Frey arrived at Nella's holding on a Tuesday in February, not specifically to find her, but because her light was the first light he had seen in 3 hours of walking, and he was cold in the way that requires stopping. She gave him a meal. At the end of it, she gave him a piece of the October wheel, 4 months of aging, the first wheel she had fully opened. Jonah Frey ate it with the attention of a person encountering something that has no immediate category in their experience. He asked what it was. She told him, aged goat cheese 4 months from the lower pasture animals. He asked if she had more. She had 18 wheels on the shelf and 11 more at various stages, more than she needed for her own household through the remaining winter. She had not yet decided what to do with the surplus, and she had not decided because the decision involved the community that had watched her buy 53 lame goats in August and made its assessment audible enough to be heard at the back of the sale yard. She thought about this for the length of time it took Jonah to finish his tea. The food would go anyway. She sent him out the following morning with 6 pounds of cheese and one instruction. It was to go to the families on the upper slope with the smallest winter stores, and her name was not to accompany it. Jonah Frey was a man of reliable discretion. He carried both the cheese and the instruction with equal care. Over the following 3 weeks, 41 pounds of aged mountain cheese from Nella's stone cellar moved through his route into the valley's winter households. She sent none of it with her name. She was patient. Word was still moving, though she could not yet feel it, moving in the way that anonymous generosity moves, not as information but as experience, felt before it is understood, the taste of it in the memory of every family that received a portion through those 3 February weeks. The pass opened on the 9th of March. The supply merchant who came through first found a community that had managed, in the households Jonah's route had reached, with less difficulty than the winter's arithmetic had suggested was possible. He had been to this valley in hard winters before. He knew the difference. He asked questions. Jonah Frey held the answer until the 2nd week of March, when he drove to Nella's holding and told her that inference was about to arrive at the correct conclusion regardless of his discretion, and that he would rather she be present when it did. 7 families came on a Saturday. They did not come to apologize. They came because they had eaten something in February that they wanted to understand and, if possible, purchase in March. She showed them the cellar, the aging shelves, the 14 remaining wheels, the observation book with the milking records from September through January, the press she had built and modified, the culture timing she had worked out across 3 failed batches, and the wheel now in its 6th month of aging, turning on the shelf in the morning light from the doorway, the best the process had produced so far. She cut it. She cut a piece for each of the 7 families. The mountains had already delivered their verdict. Not in ceremony, in the specific language of a community that had been fed through the hardest month of a hard winter by cheese made from 53 lame goats that no one had wanted, in a stone building the mountain kept at the correct temperature without being asked, by a woman whose observation book had been telling her since September that this was what was going to happen if she was patient enough to let it. A man named Georg Widener came on the 2nd Saturday. He had been at the Brenner sale in August. He had said something within Nella's hearing about a widow with more optimism than judgment. He did not bring up August. Neither did she. What he brought was a notebook. He had a north-facing stone outbuilding on his own holding. Same slope orientation, same mountain. He wanted to know if the temperature was consistent year-round. She told him it would be. She walked him through the process the following Tuesday: culture timing, press geometry, salting schedule, rind management, turning intervals. She brought the observation book. She showed him what 31 years of paying attention to the right things looks like when it is organized and applied. He wrote it down. She was, for the first time since her husband had died and left her with this slope and this holding, exactly where she had meant to be. Not finished, not comfortable in the sense of a person who has stopped, but placed correctly with the right animals on the right ground, making the right thing from what the mountain offered, by the specific daily work of a person who had noticed something 20 years ago and had finally had the occasion to prove it. The wheel Georg Widener pressed in his own, outbuilding the following spring would be ready in June. He brought her a piece when he cut it. It was, she told him, very nearly right. He went back and adjusted the culture timing. The second wheel was better. Nothing about it looked magical. Every part looked earned.